Grandma, why are you still alive? My granddaughter asked the question with the innocent curiosity only a child could have, but it was what happened next that changed my life forever. The dining room fell quiet for half a second. Then my daughter-in-law Rachel laughed softly and took a sip of her iced tea. Some people just don't know when it's time to move on, she said. A few people at the table smiled awkwardly. My son Jason stared at his plate. No one corrected her. No one looked at me. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of 72 years settle across my shoulders. Outside, the late summer sun glowed over the backyard I had spent decades caring for. Inside, I suddenly felt like a stranger in my own family. I smiled politely and reached for my water glass. That was all. No argument. No tears. No dramatic scene. I simply smiled. The rest of the dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Rachel talked about a vacation she wanted to take. Jason discussed work. My grandchildren laughed about school. Every now and then someone glanced at me, almost expecting a reaction. I gave them none. After 45 years of marriage, 2 children, countless sacrifices, and more sleepless nights than I could remember, I had learned something important. Silence often reveals more than anger ever could. When dinner ended, I thanked everyone for coming. Rachel seemed surprised by how calm I was. Jason barely met my eyes as they gathered their things. Within minutes, the house was empty again. The quiet that followed felt different from the peaceful solitude I usually enjoyed. This silence carried a message. I walked slowly through the house, turning off lights and straightening chairs. The family photographs on the walls seemed to belong to another lifetime. There was Jason at age 10 holding a fishing pole beside his father. There was our Christmas portrait from 1998. There was the picture from the day he graduated college, the same college I had helped pay for by working extra shifts and postponing my own retirement plans. I paused in front of that photograph longer than I meant to. My late husband, Richard, used to say that people show you who they are when they think you have nothing left to offer. At the time, I never fully understood what he meant. That night, standing alone in the hallway of the home we had built together, I finally did. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the kitchen window. The clock ticked softly above the stove. The tea cooled untouched in my hands. I replayed every word from dinner. Not because it hurt. Surprisingly, the pain had already begun turning into something else. Clarity. For months I had ignored the signs. The forgotten invitations. The shortened phone calls. The conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Now the pieces fit together. They weren't waiting for me to live. They were waiting for me to disappear. And that was when I made a decision that would change every one of our lives. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, something I had done almost every day since Richard passed away. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawn sprinkler somewhere down the street. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the sky slowly turn shades of pink and gold. For years, mornings had been my favorite time of day. They felt full of possibility. Lately, they had felt more like a reminder of how much had changed. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about all the years that had led to this moment. Jason had not always been distant. He had once been the little boy who followed me around the grocery store asking endless questions. He had been the teenager who called me whenever he needed advice. After his father died, I told myself that his growing distance was grief. Then I blamed work. Then marriage. I always found an excuse because that was easier than accepting the truth. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text message from Rachel appeared on the screen. It was a photograph of a dining room table she had found online. The caption read, "This would look perfect in the house someday." Someday. I stared at those 7 letters longer than I should have. She had not asked how I was doing. She had not apologized for the previous evening. She had not even attempted to hide what she meant. To her, the house was already becoming hers. I set the phone down without replying. Later that afternoon, I drove to the grocery store. The cashier, a young woman named Emily, who had worked there for years, smiled when she saw me. "How have you been, Miss Mitchell?" she asked. It was such a simple question, but it caught me off guard. She looked directly at me when she spoke. She waited for an answer. She treated me like I still mattered. I realized how rare that had become. On the drive home, I thought about something Richard used to say. He believed gratitude revealed character. People who appreciated kindness never forgot it. People who saw kindness as an obligation always wanted more. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes. The maple tree Richard planted 20 years earlier swayed gently in the breeze. The flower beds I had cared for every spring were beginning to bloom again. Every inch of the property held a memory. Every room carried part of our story. Yet the people who stood to inherit it seemed to value only the dollar amount attached to it. That evening, I opened an old wooden box I kept in my bedroom closet. Inside were important documents, family photographs, and letters Richard had written over the years. At the very bottom sat a business card I had not looked at in almost 3 years. It belonged to Martin Reynolds, the attorney who had helped us organize our estate plans. I turned the card over slowly in my hands. Then I placed it on the nightstand beside my bed. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt completely calm. Not angry. Not heartbroken. Calm. Because I was beginning to understand something important. The people waiting for my life to end had no idea I was about to start making decisions of my own. The following Tuesday, I called Martin Reynolds. His voice sounded exactly as I remembered, steady, professional, and reassuring. When I told him who I was, there was a brief pause before he warmly asked how I had been doing. Most people asked out of habit. Martin sounded like he genuinely wanted to know. We agreed to meet the next morning at his office downtown. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next day was clear and bright. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the reception area, surrounded by framed certificates and photographs of community events Martin had supported over the years. When he stepped out to greet me, his expression softened immediately. He asked about Richard. Even after 3 years, people who had truly respected my husband still spoke about him as though he mattered. That alone told me a great deal. We spent the first few minutes talking about ordinary things. Then Martin folded his hands on the desk and looked at me carefully. "Ava," he said, "what brings you here today?" I took a slow breath and explained everything. The family dinner. The comments. The growing sense that I was becoming less of a person and more of an obstacle. I expected embarrassment as I spoke the words aloud. Instead, I felt relief. Martin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder with my name on it. Seeing it there surprised me. Richard had always believed in preparation. He planned for emergencies, retirement, taxes, and every possible future. Martin reviewed the estate documents with me line by line. As he did, I realized something that completely changed the way I viewed my situation. The house belonged solely to me. The investment accounts were under my control. The savings Richard and I had built over decades remained exactly where we intended them to be. No one had authority over any of it except me. I sat quietly while Martin explained the details. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something I had nearly forgotten. Security. The future that Rachel and Jason seemed to imagine was not guaranteed. Not even close. Before I left, Martin leaned back in his chair and gave me a thoughtful look. "You spent your whole life taking care of other people," he said. "There is nothing wrong with finally taking care of yourself." The words followed me all the way home. That afternoon, I stopped at a small diner and ordered lunch. I sat near the window watching people walk by. Young couples, retirees, parents, pushing strollers. Everyone seemed busy living their lives. Somewhere along the way, I realized I had stopped living mine. I had become focused on preserving a future for people who barely noticed my present. When I returned home, there was a voicemail from Jason. He wanted to know if I could watch the grandchildren that weekend because he and Rachel had plans. No greeting. No questions about how I was feeling. Just an expectation. I listened to the message twice. Then I quietly deleted it. For the first time in years, I did not immediately rearrange my life around someone else's convenience. Instead, I walked into Richard's old study, sat down at the desk, and opened a blank notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote 3 simple words. My next chapter. Over the next several days, I began paying closer attention. Not because I was looking for reasons to be hurt, but because I finally stopped making excuses for what I saw. Once you stop explaining away people's behavior, the truth becomes remarkably clear. On Thursday evening, Jason called again. This time he sounded slightly irritated that I had not returned his previous message. He asked if I could still watch the children on Saturday. I told him I already had plans. There was a long silence on the line. Not because he was concerned about me, but because he seemed genuinely surprised that I might have a life that did not revolve around his schedule. "What kind of plans?" he asked. I smiled to myself. It was such a strange question. As if I needed permission to spend my own time however I wished. "Just some things I need to take care of," I said politely. Another silence followed. Then he ended the call sooner than usual. That Saturday morning, I visited several neighborhoods I had always admired but never explored. Small coastal towns had once been a dream Richard and I shared. We used to sit on the back porch after dinner and talk about renting a little cottage near the water someday. Life had gotten busy. Then retirement arrived. Then illness. Then grief. Somewhere along the way, someday had quietly disappeared. As I walked through one charming downtown area filled with bookstores, cafes, and flower shops, I felt lighter than I had in years. No one knew me there. No one expected anything from me. For a few hours, I was simply a woman enjoying her day. When I returned home that evening, I found a group text from Rachel. She had sent several photographs of houses, renovation ideas, and furniture layouts. Most people would have thought nothing of it. But I noticed something she probably never intended me to notice. Every image resembled my home. The same style. The same layout. The same vision. She was decorating a future she believed already belonged to her. I did not respond. Instead, I made dinner, watered my flowers, and sat on the patio as the sun began to set. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. A cardinal landed on the fence for a moment before flying away. Richard loved cardinals. He always said they appeared when you needed a reminder. Looking around, I realized how much of my life I had spent maintaining things for other people. The house, the holidays, the traditions, the expectations. I had built a beautiful life, yet somewhere along the way I had allowed others to decide what my final chapters should look like. That night, I opened the notebook again. Under the words "my next chapter," I began writing a list. Places I wanted to visit. Things I wanted to learn. Experiences I had postponed for decades. The list grew longer than I expected. When I finally put down the pen, I stared at the page and felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Excitement. For the first time in years, I was not thinking about what my family wanted from me. I was thinking about what I wanted for myself. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that some very big changes were coming. The following week, I made a decision that would have terrified the old version of me. I called a real estate agent. Her name was Linda, and she had sold several homes in the area over the years. When she arrived, she walked through the property slowly, complimenting the garden, the hardwood floors, and the natural light that filled the living room. She saw what I had always seen. Not just a house, but a life carefully built over decades. When she finished her tour, she sat with me at the kitchen table and discussed current market values. The number she gave me was significantly higher than I expected. I thanked her and promised to think about it. The truth was, I had already started thinking about it days earlier. That evening, Jason stopped by unexpectedly. He rarely visited without a reason, which made his sudden appearance stand out. Rachel was with him. They carried a pie from a local bakery and smiles that felt slightly rehearsed. We sat in the living room making small talk. Then, little by little, the conversation drifted toward the future. Rachel mentioned retirement communities. Jason talked about how difficult it must be maintaining a large property alone. Neither of them directly said what they wanted, but their meaning hung in the air between us. I listened quietly. The old me would have felt hurt. The new me felt observant. At one point, Rachel glanced around the room and said, "This house has so much potential for a growing family." The sentence was simple, but it revealed everything. She was already imagining herself here. She was already arranging furniture in her mind. She was already spending something that did not belong to her. I smiled and poured more coffee. Neither of them noticed how carefully I was watching. After they left, I walked through every room of the house. The guest room where relatives stayed during holidays. The dining room where birthdays had been celebrated. The study where Richard spent countless evenings reading. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for years. Was I staying because I loved the house or because I was afraid to leave it? The answer arrived more quickly than I expected. I loved the memories. But the memories were coming with me no matter where I lived. A house could hold a story, but it could not be the story itself. The next morning, I called Linda back. We scheduled professional photographs and began discussing a listing strategy. Everything suddenly moved faster. Paperwork arrived. Appointments filled my calendar. Possibilities started opening in front of me. For the first time since Richard passed away, my future felt larger. Then my past. Meanwhile, messages from Jason and Rachel became strangely frequent. They checked in more often. They asked more questions. They seemed unusually interested in my plans. The timing was impossible to ignore. As I sat at my kitchen table one evening reviewing documents, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Rachel asking if I had ever considered transferring the property to family while I was still alive. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone down. Then I looked at the stack of papers beside me and smiled. They still believed they knew exactly how this story would end. They had no idea they were about to be completely wrong. Over the next month, the house became the center of activity. Photographers came first, then inspectors, then prospective buyers. Each appointment brought a strange mixture of nostalgia and excitement. I expected the process to be emotional, and sometimes it was. Certain rooms still carried echoes of old conversations. Certain corners reminded me of Christmas mornings, birthday dinners, and quiet evenings with Richard. But alongside those memories came something stronger. Freedom. Every document I signed felt less like an ending and more like an introduction to a life I had nearly forgotten was possible. Word spread quickly. Before long, Jason called asking why strangers were visiting the property. I explained that I was exploring my options. He sounded unsettled. Not angry. Unsettled. There is a difference. Anger comes from opposition. Unsettled comes from uncertainty. For the first time, he no longer knew what I was planning. A few days later, he and Rachel arrived without notice. Rachel brought pastries. Jason offered to help with yard work. Their sudden generosity would have been touching if it had appeared 6 months earlier. Instead, it felt carefully timed. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee while they asked casual questions about real estate values, retirement plans, and future living arrangements. I answered politely but revealed very little. The less information I shared, the more nervous they seemed to become. At one point, Rachel smiled and said, "You know, family should keep things in the family." I nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes," I replied. The conversation ended there. A week later, Linda called with exciting news. We had received multiple strong offers. One buyer stood out immediately. The terms were excellent. The closing timeline matched perfectly with the plans I had quietly begun developing. That evening, I sat alone on the back patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and lavender. I thought about the frightened woman who had sat in this same chair months earlier wondering why her own family seemed eager to push her aside. She felt very far away now. The next morning, I accepted the offer. The house officially went under contract. I did not announce it to anyone right away. I wanted a little time to enjoy the feeling privately. For years, every major decision in my life had revolved around someone else's needs. This decision belonged entirely to me. A few days later, Jason discovered the listing status online. His call came within minutes. He sounded shocked. Rachel sounded even more shocked when she later left a voicemail asking if there had been some misunderstanding. I listened to both messages while sitting beside a small harbor in the coastal town I had been visiting regularly. Fishing boats rocked gently on the water. Seagulls drifted overhead. For the first time in years, the future felt larger than the past. I slipped my phone back into my purse and continued walking along the shoreline. Behind me, questions were beginning to grow. Ahead of me, answers were finally taking shape. As the closing date approached, something interesting began to happen. Jason and Rachel stopped asking questions and started making assumptions. I could see it in the way they spoke. They no longer seemed worried about the sale itself. Instead, they acted as though they were already calculating what would come next. During one family dinner, Rachel casually mentioned a larger kitchen she had always wanted. A few minutes later, she talked about converting a spare room into a home office. Neither comment directly referenced my property, but the connection was obvious. She spoke with the confidence of someone discussing plans rather than possibilities. Jason was not much different. He began talking about paying off certain debts and taking fewer overtime shifts at work. Whenever I listened, I found myself remembering the lesson Richard used to repeat. Never confuse expectation with entitlement. One afternoon, my granddaughter called to tell me about a shopping trip Rachel had taken. She innocently described furniture stores, fabric samples, and paint colors. Children often reveal truths adults work very hard to hide. I thanked her for the conversation and sat quietly for a long time afterward. It was remarkable. The same people who rarely asked about my happiness seemed deeply invested in what they believed they would eventually receive. Yet not once had either of them asked a simple question. What do you want, Ava? The answer was becoming clearer every day. I wanted peace. I wanted freedom. I wanted to wake up each morning without feeling like a countdown clock in someone else's plans. A week before closing, I finalized several important meetings. Martin helped me update documents. Financial arrangements were reviewed. Future plans became official. Every signature brought a sense of calm confidence. There was no anger behind my decisions. No desire for revenge. Only clarity. The life Richard and I built had been created through decades of sacrifice, discipline, and hard work. It deserved to be handled with intention, not assumption. Meanwhile, Jason and Rachel appeared more relaxed than ever. Their anxiety had vanished. Their smiles seemed easier. Their phone calls became friendlier. Looking back, I think they believed the outcome was already secured. They thought the final chapter had been written. What they did not understand was that I had been writing an entirely different ending. 2 days before closing, I invited the entire family to my house for a special dinner the following weekend. Jason immediately accepted. Rachel sounded almost excited. She asked whether there was something important I wanted to announce. I told her there was. That answer seemed to satisfy everyone. After the calls ended, I walked through the quiet house one last time. The walls looked the same. The rooms looked the same. Yet everything had changed. By this point, the decision was complete. The future was already moving toward me. The only thing left was for everyone else to finally learn the truth. The family arrived exactly on time. Jason carried a bottle of wine. Rachel brought a dessert from an expensive bakery. The grandchildren ran through the house laughing, completely unaware that this evening would be remembered for years. I greeted everyone warmly and invited them inside. Dinner was pleasant. Almost unusually pleasant. Rachel complimented the food several times. Jason asked questions about my recent trips. The conversation flowed easily, but beneath it I could feel a quiet anticipation. They were waiting for something. When the plates had been cleared and everyone settled into the living room, I stood and thanked them for coming. The room grew still. Rachel exchanged a quick glance with Jason. I noticed it immediately. They looked like people expecting good news. I smiled and picked up a folder from the coffee table. There are a few things I wanted to share, I said. Jason leaned forward slightly. Rachel sat perfectly still. First, I continued, the house officially sold 3 days ago. For a brief moment, neither of them reacted. Then Rachel smiled. That is wonderful, she said. It must be a huge relief. Her voice sounded calm, but I could hear excitement underneath it. Jason nodded in agreement. I thanked them both and opened the folder. Second, I said, I have finalized my future plans. Now they were paying very close attention. I purchased a small home near the coast. Rachel blinked. Jason looked surprised. You already bought another place, he asked. I did, I replied. I wanted to begin my next chapter while I still had the energy to enjoy it. The room became noticeably quieter. I continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. I explained the volunteer work I planned to do, the classes I intended to take, the places I hoped to visit, the life I was building. None of it included waiting around to become someone else's responsibility. Rachel's smile slowly faded. Jason looked increasingly confused. Finally, he cleared his throat. What about the rest of the money? He asked. The question hung in the air. Honest. Direct. Impossible to misunderstand. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. Most of it has already been allocated, I said calmly. Some went toward my new home. Some has been placed into long-term investments. A significant portion has been committed to several charitable organizations Richard and I supported for many years. Complete silence followed. Rachel stared at me as though she had misheard. Jason's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed to know what to say. I felt no satisfaction in their discomfort. Only clarity. They had spent months imagining a future based upon assumptions. I had spent those same months building a future based upon decisions. There was a difference. A very important difference. I looked around the room at the family photographs, the familiar furniture, and the life that had brought me to this moment. Then I realized something remarkable. The weight I had carried for so long was finally gone. The next morning, I woke up in my new home to the sound of waves rolling gently against the shoreline. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows and painted golden patterns across the hardwood floor. For a few moments, I simply stood there holding a cup of coffee and looking out at the water. No expectations. No tension. No feeling that I needed to earn my place in someone else's life. Just peace. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I had almost forgotten was possible. I joined a local community group. I volunteered at a small literacy program twice a week. I took long walks along the harbor and spent afternoons reading books that had sat untouched on my shelves for years. Everywhere I went, people asked about my interests, my plans, and my stories. They treated me as a person with a future instead of a person whose best years were behind her. Occasionally, Jason called. Our conversations were polite but different now. The certainty he once carried had disappeared. Rachel rarely spoke during those calls. I never mentioned the dinner. I never mentioned the assumptions they had made. There was nothing left to prove. Life had already delivered the lesson more effectively than any argument could have. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after I moved, I received a handwritten card from my granddaughter. Inside was a simple note. She told me she missed our visits and wanted to spend more time together. At the bottom, she had drawn a picture of the ocean beside my new house. I smiled for a long time after reading it. Children often see things adults miss. She did not care about property, money, or inheritance. She cared about connection. That realization gave me hope. As the seasons changed, I noticed something else changing too. The bitterness I once carried began to fade. Not because I forgot what happened, but because I stopped allowing it to define me. The question that once echoed in my mind no longer hurt. In a strange way, it had become a turning point. It forced me to look honestly at my life. It forced me to choose myself. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I took out the notebook that had started everything. The words my next chapter were still written across the first page. Beneath them was a long list of dreams, plans, and experiences. Many had already been crossed off. Others were waiting patiently. I turned to a blank page and began writing a new list. More places to see. More people to meet. More memories to create. Then I paused and looked out at the water. For years, I had believed my story was winding down. I thought my role was to quietly step aside and make room for everyone else. I was wrong. Life had not been asking me to disappear. It had been asking me to begin again. And for the first time in a very long time, I was excited to see what came next.